Hey everyone, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. I'm Matthew Christoph. On this podcast, we talk about environmental sciences. If this is your first time here, there's a whole gamut of stuff you can go back and look at. The archive's full, from climate change to fishing to hunting to God knows what, everything in between, wildfire, all kinds of stuff. So check it out. This episode, I brought on Ryan Prosser, and he is an environmental toxicologist from the University of Guelph. And really awesome dude. I wanted to bring him on to talk about the reality of the use of, chemicals in the environment. Because there's a lot of background, a lot of fear in our culture around, the use of chemicals like herbicides and pesticides and that kind of stuff on the environment. And justly so, because there's a track record of some bad stuff happening. So I brought him on to talk about the research that goes into some of this stuff and want to try and hash out the reality from the fiction, from the concerns to the reality kind of thing, right? Really awesome dude. He really understands his history when it comes to these issues. We talk about, Rachel Carlson's book regarding DDT, Silent Spring. We talked about, glyphosate was the big one I wanted to talk about, which is a herbicide used in forestry mainly, but also in a bunch of other different stuff like agriculture. And we just kind of talked about the use of chemicals, period, on the landscape and where we should be concerned, where we maybe shouldn't be as concerned as we are, and also how that the use of these chemicals might actually be environmentally friendly, saving us, a bigger carbon imprint, saving us from a bigger carbon footprint, all kinds of stuff like that. It's hard to see it that way, but I don't know, he's convinced me. It is. I think if it's done properly with the proper amount of research, making sure that we're not having an impact on things we don't want to have an impact on, he's convinced me it's environmentally sound. I think it's probably the safest way to go forward. So it's pretty cool. Sponsors for this episode, Greenlink Forestry as always, Damaged Timber, also an apparel company. Go to damagetimber.com, put in Your Forest 10 at checkout. You can get 10% off. They have all kinds of stuff, hats, toques, sweaters, t-shirts. And they put 10% of everything that they make towards a environmental sciences scholarship. So if you want to support environmental sciences by wearing clothes, go to damagetimber.com, check them out. And the main sponsor, I can't thank them enough, is West Fraser. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. You guys are allowing me to keep doing this. Thank you so much. They're the main sponsor for 2019, and their funds are made available through the Forest Resource Improvement Association of Alberta. Thanks so much, guys. Can't thank you enough. Without any further messing around, let's get into it. It's me and Ryan talking about toxicology, chemicals, all kinds of stuff like that. You guys are going to like it. Let's do this.
So my name is Ryan Prosser. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of Guelph. I got into environmental sciences right off the bat. I did an undergraduate degree at Queen's University in biology, but I actually went to teachers college after that because I wanted to become a teacher. I was, keen on that and being a high school teacher. So I went to teachers college. I actually became a high school chemistry teacher for about 6 years. And then I decided that, I wanted to sort of give graduate school a shot, see what it was like. It was interesting to me. And then, so I came back to the University of Guelph to do my PhD. So I did my PhD with Dr. Paul Sibley and Dr. Keith Solomon in the School of Environmental Sciences. After that, I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Environment and Climate Change Canada in their Aquatic Contaminants Research Division. And I was there for about 2.5 years. And then I came back to Guelph to take the current position that I'm in. So right. I've been a prof for about 2.5 years now. And so I have a research program. I have a group of graduate students that are all working on a variety of topics in the field of environmental toxicology.
Nice. No, that's awesome. It's not one that I imagine is, I don't imagine there's a straight path into that though. I don't even know how many schools in Canada or the States offer that kind of a degree.
Yeah, it's sort of, it's a little specialized. I mean, it's a very multidisciplinary area because, you're looking at a lot of aspects of chemistry and biology. But yeah, I mean, Guelph is known. It's got a sort of proud history of environmental toxicology. And then obviously University of Saskatchewan also, they have the toxicology center which was really generated by a former Guelph grad.
For
So,
sure. Yeah.
it all comes back to Guelph.
Humble brag.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Awesome. So, the main reason I wanted to bring you on, obviously, I don't know a lot about herbicides and glyphosate and pesticides myself, besides what I've heard in the industry and other people talk about. But I think as soon as people say, like, the word chemicals or herbicide or pesticide, like, even myself, I find myself cringing a bit, right? And going like, oh, like, why can't we do something like quote unquote natural? And do we need to do that? And because there's this kind of, I don't know, this post-apocalyptic view of it, right? Like we're like
Yeah, yeah,
Monsanto's taking over the world and going to genetically engineer everything into
yeah,
being so, very Margaret Atwood-esque or something.
yeah, yeah.
And so I wonder, I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to get into this because there's so many angles to come from. And I think
Hmm.
a lot of it comes from, well, Rachel Carlson's book, right? Silent Spring.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think that was released in 62. And
60,
something
yeah.
like that, and talking about DDT and stuff. Could you just quickly talk about, maybe you'll probably know way more about it than I do, kind
Mm-mm.
of what that book was about, kind of just, I mean, the impact of DDT, and because I feel like that's kind of the focal point of how the public got worried about chemicals in the environment,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah. No, so I mean, Rachel Carson's book centered around, the name Silent Spring was, she had a farm, and essentially in the spring she would normally hear the songbirds, and she wasn't hearing them, or not to the same extent she was previously. And there had been some research going on at the time that DDT and other organochlorine insecticides, that ilk of DDT type, were having an impact on particularly birds, right? And eggshell thinning and that sort of thing. But anyway, she was able to sort of, I think the reason her book was so impactful was that she was able to sort of communicate to to the public, sort of some of the research that was coming out looking at our use of pesticides was having a detrimental effect on the environment and the different animals in the environment. And I think she was able to communicate. I mean, she was a well-known author before Silent Spring. She had written about different ecosystems within the sea and that sort of thing. But anyway, she was a really effective communicator, but she was able to distill down to the public what was happening. And there was a lot of pushback from industry on what she was saying, right? They were trying to discredit her, but the data that was coming out was indicating that, yeah, these insecticides were having an adverse effect. They're persistent, so they would stick around in the environment for long periods of time, and they would bioaccumulate and biomagnify. So the concentrations would get bigger, higher as you go up the food chain. And so, yeah, I mean, bald eagles nearly went extinct in the United States because of the use of DDT and organochlorine. So,
That's wild. I didn't know that was
so
true. Actually, I had never heard that.
well, yeah, it really hit raptors, right? They're sort of at the top of the food
Right.
chain. It hit them really hard, and basically, it wasn't killing adult birds, but what it was doing was, it was causing their eggs to be thin, their eggs, the shell of their eggs. So basically, when the parents would roost, or warm their eggs, they would break.
Mm,
So basically, there was no reproduction happening anyway.
right.
So yeah, I mean, that's really, and she sort of brought that in a really clear way to the public, and I think that's, and it's understandable that people. I mean, it's a really good book. I think everybody should read it. It's important lessons to be learned historically, but it's understandable that people would have, fear the potential risk that pesticides could have on the environment or on human health,
Absolutely.
um, because they've had a little, there's a sort of a negative, historical record
Hmm.
of their use, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of where I see it coming from, right? As people look back on that, and that was a real situation in which
Mhm.
they're right. The chemicals we were putting onto the landscape were having a detrimental effect. Am I right in saying that later found out that there was actually like birth defects in humans because of it as well? Is that true?
Yeah, so no, that's not for
Oh,
DDT.
okay.
The data, yeah. So, I mean, I think what you might be thinking of is 2,4,5-T.
Oh, yeah.
So, 2,4,5-T was another herbicide, as well as 2,4-D, which we still use today. But these are two herbicides, and they really, and again, Monsanto, as well as some other chemical companies, were behind the creation of them. But they were the active ingredient in Agent Orange.
Right. Oh, okay.
So this was the Agent Orange was the product that was used. I mean, it became popular because of its use in Vietnam during the war as a defoliant, right, to get rid of the foliage. Um, Now, the herbicides themselves, 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D, were not teratogenic meaning causing birth defects, or mutagenic, causing mutations. But when they're manufactured, if they're not manufactured properly, there's some byproducts, so some contaminants that can be in the mixture. And this group of contaminants that were the problem were dioxins. So it wasn't the actual active ingredient of the herbicides, but byproducts that were produced due to not being manufactured properly. These byproducts, these dioxins, are highly mutagenic and carcinogenic. And so those are the ones that can cause birth defects.
Gotcha.
But understandably, the public, when you say Agent Orange causes mutations, I mean, it all gets lumped together. But it wasn't actually the herbicide active ingredient, the herbicidal chemical. It was the other byproducts that were in it due to improper manufacturing.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. But I guess my point is that humans have a history of creating some poor chemicals that we used for a long time, didn't realize their detrimental effect, and then one day realized their detrimental effect and then stopped using them. So I think that's kind of where a lot of that, I would guess, comes from in the public, right? Is this that, well, it seems like we'd use something for decades and then we find out later, like, oh shit, that was a bad idea. So I think
along that lines, if I can interject quickly, and that's an important point. But one of the things I think it's important to recognize is, and one of the accomplishments of the work of Rachel Carson and Silent Spring, out of that, eventually, not far after, when the public started to become concerned, in the United States, it sort of ended up in the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So I think, because of the good work of people like Rachel Carson and bringing to the public these issues, there are tons of examples where governments have taken action to hopefully address that issue of repeating those mistakes.
Gotcha.
So out of that work, and you're right, I mean, we were creating products, we weren't regulating them, right? Pesticides, we were just like, hey, this really works, let's go for it. But out of that, when we started to see that there is potential adverse, effects on the environment, then we started to create a regulatory framework for those products. Same thing would happen for pharmaceuticals, right? I mean, it was the Wild West back in the day. People were selling all kinds of stuff, but we realized, okay, we got to regulate this stuff because, one, it's got to work, right? We don't want consumers to be swindled, right?
Yeah.
It's
preferably.
That's pharmaceutical especially, yeah. But at the same time, we want to protect the environment and human health. So that's where we get the US EPA. In Canada, we have Health Canada and a division of Health Canada that regulates pesticides, the Pest Management Regulatory Agency. There's a sort of a very strict regulatory framework for that one has to go through if they want to bring a pesticide to market. And the reason that exists is to try to avoid what we've done in the past, right? And so that's an important thing to remember, is that there is regulatory frameworks. You can't just make a pesticide in your garage and start marketing it, right, and selling it to people and using it.
Yeah, so it's highly regulated now, so that those mistakes would be harder to make, I imagine, now, because everything is tested and researched before it's applied on the actual landscape.
Yeah, and then, like I said, there's two components. They're looking at, is it efficacious? Because basically, the PMRA, they don't want to register anything that isn't going to be effective, because it's pointless. Why put a chemical out on the landscape that's not even going to be effective for farmers? So there's that kind of data, field trials, but then there's also a lot of data that goes into looking at the potential impact on environmental health as well as human health. And so if someone was to, if they had some time on their hands and wanted to look up, what do I actually have to go to if I was a pesticide or crop protection company, what would I actually have to go to in order to get my product registered for sale in Canada?
Mm-hmm.
And you can go on PMRA's website and look at all the data that would be required in a package, a registration package. And you start to get an idea of how much data, how much scientific experimental data goes into that registration package before it will even be considered for use or for sale,
Mm-hmm.
right, in Canada. So, yeah, I mean, pesticides are up there with pharmaceuticals in terms of the level of regulatory, uh, work that has to be done in order for it to be registered.
Good. That's awesome. That's good to hear. Like, I mean, that's what we want, right?
Yeah,
We want to make sure that we're protecting all the values for future generations and all that good stuff, as
yeah,
well as accomplishing our
and
current goal, right?
like I said too, like all of this data is available to the public, and it can be a little bit challenging to digest, but it, you'll start to get an idea of what efforts we go to, or the government goes to, PMRA goes to sort of avoid unnecessary impact on the environment and human health, for
Yeah,
sure.
for sure. Interesting. That's cool. And I'm glad we got to talk about those ones. I kind of wanted to set it up that way so that people can understand where we're coming from, right? So that we know where we're going, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
like, I mean, the main
Yeah.
reason I wanted to bring you on was to talk about glyphosate. And am I right in saying you've done a bunch of research on
Yep.
that, right? Um,
Yeah. So, I mean, myself and my collaborators, we do a lot of work looking at the potential, particularly environmental impact of pesticides, glyphosate being one of them.
okay. And so a lot of what, for example, like for the use that I know besides agriculture is like in the forest industry. I believe
Mm-hmm.
it's glyphosate used to. Is it glyphosate? Is glyphosate a herbicide as well? Right?
Yeah, glyphosate's a herbicide.
Okay.
So just to give you, if you mind, I'll give you a little bit of
You do
background.
it, man. You're the professional. I'm
Yeah.
just here trying to
So
spin the
yeah,
story.
no, that's fine. So like to get in the Canadian context for forestry, about 95% of herbicide use in forestry is glyphosate. So it's the dominant herbicide used in, and there's sort of two general ways it's used, either site preparation.
Mhm.
Um, so you've clear cut, or you have an area that's been cut, and you want to prepare it before, you want to sort of knock down any of those broadleaf weeds or fast growing trees before you go back and put your seedlings in, right?
Yeah, I just want to interject
Um,
real quickly just for that because
okay,
I
sure.
think a lot of people, just to back that up so people understand why that's important to
Yeah.
do. Um,
Okay. Yeah. Good.
just because, so in Canada, for people that don't know, when we harvest something, we harvest a stand of trees, we're obligated by law to go back in and have that same species composition on the landscape. So if you cut,
Mhm.
90% conifer stand, and you cut it down, and then immediately coming back on that landscape, which happens all the time, is a bunch of aspen or some hardwood that's growing really, really fast. That's going to outcompete that
Mhm.
conifer and kill it out. And so legally, companies are they have to go back in and try to promote that conifer growth. And really, one of the only ways to do it, it seems like, from an economic
Mhm.
perspective, is using herbicides. So I just wanted to point that out before, so people understand
Mhm.
why it's important that they need to be used, and we can't just let the forest a lot of times grow back naturally, quote unquote, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'll just add to that, because you talked about alternatives. I mean, there you could go and do it, I imagine, physically, but we also have to think about big picture. You can imagine the not only the cost to the company, there's that to think about, but then also the use of fossil fuels, right? If you're going to go and mechanically do that work, right? So if you think about it, and there's people that have done studies to show that, in agriculture more, but effective use of pesticides can actually reduce our carbon footprint, right? Because if you have products that are effective, one pass gets the job done, right? Less fuel is being burnt, a lot less energy is being used to do it. So
Mm.
that's an important thing to think about. Like, sure, they're mechanical is an option, but there is a cost, and there's an environmental cost to that too.
Right. It's not just economic. That's a good point to make. No, I appreciate that. Thank you. I
Yeah.
didn't know that. That's I've been kind of on a climate change kick lately, so it's totally
Mhm,
relevant
mhm.
to where my thoughts have been for sure.
Yeah. And then the other aspect is that the herbicides are used is for conifer release. So after those seedlings have grown, you might go back again, to again knock down those competing broadleaf trees, because you want to give the conifer species, the species that was there previously, you want to give it sort of a head start, and you don't want it competing with those broadleaves that could shade it or inhibit its growth, right?
Mm-hmm. For sure. And that's part of the required biodiversity of the landscape. We want to make sure that the diversity of habitat is
Mm-hmm.
more or less, stagnant over time. It's not, you don't have too much of one and not enough of the other. So that's part of that
Yeah.
equation as well,
Yeah.
protecting other values, right? So cool.
Yeah.
So how does, I guess it's important to talk about like how does this glyphosate work? And I want to get into kind of some of the concerns that like the public has had, like whether let's start with like how does it work so that we understand that mechanism.
So how glyphosate actually kills plants is it inhibits, and I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible, but there's a pathway, there's a biochemical pathway in plants that makes a certain type of amino acids. Now, you and I, animals, we consume the majority of our amino acids, right? We get the amino acids from the food we eat, your meat and that kind of thing. Plants aren't consumers, right? They don't eat. Well, there's a few plants out there, right? Venus flytraps and stuff that eat other organisms. But for the most part, plants, they have to make whatever they need. So anyway, there's a pathway that's important for plants to make these amino acids. And what happens is glyphosate blocks that pathway. So basically the plant can't make certain amino acids, which means it can't make certain proteins. And basically, any growth basically is shut down, and eventually it leads to the death of the plant, right? So I think the important thing to take away is that a lot of the herbicides we currently have and the new ones coming on the market are incredibly selective for plants. They're targeting biological pathways that are only in plants, or more importantly, not in humans or vertebrates,
Right.
or even invertebrates. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So that pathway that it works on, that inhibition of the production of the amino acids, we don't have that pathway, right? So that target for that chemical doesn't exist in us. So it's very selective, very specialized for plants. So that's how it works,
right,
as a herbicide.
Okay. And I'm guessing there's a lot of research being done to make sure that that's the case, and that there isn't some kind of unforeseen effect down the line or something like that, or it's not accumulating in our food or whatever, right?
Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot of data, first of all, to look at. I mean, there's a number of studies that have looked at how does glyphosate actually work, right? What's its mode of action? So there's a number of papers describing, what enzyme it actually binds to within this pathway. So it's very detailed on what it does to plants. We have lots of information about that. And on the other side is we have a lot of information, and part of this, when companies started to look at using it as a herbicide, a lot of the data that goes into, what effects could it have on humans, mammals, or what effects could it have on non-target species. We have a really large data set to look at that, particularly for glyphosate. So there's a lot of data that looks at how it works in plants and what its potential effect is on we'll call them non-target organisms. So there's tons of data.
And how long has glyphosate been around? So just so I know how long the body of work has been around, right?
Yeah. So the exact date that glyphosate was registered, I would say probably we're talking about the 80s.
Okay, so it's been around decades.
It was probably, yeah. Oh yeah. It's not all that new. I mean, the development of it probably occurred in the 70s as well, right? Because there's a time lag in the development. It takes almost 10 years, right, to bring a pesticide to market, right? From when you first sort of discover a potential chemical and then bringing it to market could be 10 years. So anyway, yeah, we've had decades of work that has been done to look at its efficacy, how well it works, as well as its potential impacts.
As well as long-term studies, I'm guessing, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so there's a number of long-term studies out there. Again, it depends on what receptor, what part of the environment you're looking at, but long-term feeding studies with rats and that kind of thing to look at, what's a safe level of exposure, right? I mean, what can we be exposed to on a daily basis, potentially in our food, but still there be no adverse effect on our health, right? Those require long-term studies with surrogates for humans.
Yeah. of course. And I think that's where a lot of people probably cringe too, right? So what do you mean? Like, what is the threshold, right? Like, I think a lot of,
Yeah.
they immediately, the
So
alarmists out there,
yeah,
like,
and
what are
I
that?
and I think an important, one of the really sort of where we, always start when it comes to toxicology is that, and this is, going back to the 15th century, Paracelsus kind of was the first to coin the phrase, the dose makes the poison, which really means that a lot of things can be toxic. Um, and can pose a risk to human health. Water, for example, if I sat you down and forced you to drink water, eventually, your heart is going to go into arrhythmia and it's going to stop. I mean, there's a certain level of water consumption that is toxic. And so anyway, the idea there is that the dose makes the poison, is that it really comes down to your level of exposure. So anything, sugar, salt, I mean, these things we would think are inert, but they could, if you're exposed to high enough amounts, could have adverse effects on your health. So the idea is that there's a threshold, there's a level that you can be exposed to on a regular basis that isn't going to have an adverse effect on your health. Now, if you exceed that, then potentially there could be adverse effects.
Right.
Um, and so with glyphosate, I mean, and the other thing too, just to step back, people are concerned, people are concerned about the use of chemicals in agriculture and forestry. But, there are a host of natural chemicals that are found in plants and that sort of thing that also potentially can be toxic. So this idea that, synthetic chemicals bad, natural chemicals okay, it comes down to it all comes down to exposure. How much are you exposed to? So anyway, with glyphosate or with any other pesticide, there's a lot of work, a lot of data, experimentation that's gone in to figure out how much can a mammal, can a human be exposed to on a daily basis, and there be no adverse effect on their health.
Right.
And so just to give you a little bit of background, these tests are done obviously in mice and rats, not in humans. And yes, a mouse and a rat is not a human, because that's one of the things people often get concerned of. Like, we did the test in rats, but that's not humans. So we do the experiment in a mouse or a rat, and then you find out a certain concentration or certain dose that would have an adverse effect. And then what they do is they apply safety factors. So you're going to divide that number by 10 or 100 or 1,000. So, when you come up with a value that's okay for humans, not only have we used rats and mouse to determine what that safe value is, but we've also lowered it in consideration that, rats and mice are not humans. So there's a lot of precaution that goes into coming up with a maximum residue limit. So the amount that is allowable in food for particular pesticides, glyphosate being one.
Yeah. And see, that's the thing. Like, I think a lot of people just assume that people that work for companies developing some of these like pesticides, you know what I mean? They look, they must be evil people trying to take over the world and just trying to make as much money as possible and whatever, right? And the
Yeah.
truth of the matter is, these are also people that have passion and they want to be, they want to improve society and the environment, that, the same as anybody else. It's just they happen to be in this business.
Well, exactly. And I mean, for example, a lot of my fellow graduate students, when I was doing my master's or PhD, some of them went into academia like me that became professors. Some of them went to work for the government. So some of them went to work for PMRA, where they're, in charge of looking through the data and deciding what can be registered and not. And others went to work for industry. But we all started, with this interest in understanding how chemicals could have an impact on the environment. And where we went, whether government, academia, or industry, really partly mainly depended on where we could, where the job was, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to get at is, yeah, these are people that are working for industry. It's easy to sort of demonize them, and industry have made some really poor choices in the past, no doubt.
Mm-hmm.
But just anecdotally from my experience, the people that I know in industry, in general, the writing's on the wall. I mean, you can't produce products that are going to have across the board adverse effects and try to hide that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the public is too well informed and connected. I mean, so we need to be upfront about the potential effects, and try to produce products that minimize any risk as much as possible, right? But still be effective. So it is easy to demonize, to sort of develop conspiracy theories to try to explain, but the reality is that, like you said, these are researchers, just, like my collaborators, who are trying to produce good products that can help consumers.
Right. No, that makes sense. So what about, like we've talked about kind of animals, you're saying it can't really, there's no pathway by which it can affect animals, like you were saying, in the dosages that it's being applied on the landscape, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what about, like, how long does it stick around? Like, does it stay in the soil? Does it have an impact on, on microbes and some of that, like the soil structure,
Mm-hmm.
or even water, right? Does it get into runoff and end up in the river and affect microbes there? Because that's another big point of concern that I think a lot of public has, is that it's the concentration, although might be small when it's applied on individual cut blocks or agricultural areas, when
Mm-hmm.
if its half-life is long enough and it survives to, or stays around long enough to be washed down into the river, the
Mm-hmm.
concentrations will increase, and that could be detrimental, right? So
Yeah.
is there any truth to that, or what's going on there?
Yeah, so I mean, and then that's a good question to ask, right? And when we talk about what is the fate of glyphosate when we apply it to the landscape, where does it go? How long is it there? Those are all really, really important, good questions. So studies again have shown that glyphosate, its half life is just a measure of how long it's going to be out there in the environment, is relatively short. So we're talking about days, weeks, not months and years. And there's a number of environmental factors that are going to impact how quickly it's going to be degraded. But there's studies out there that have shown the half-life in soil can range from 1 day to, let's say, 14 days. And the same thing in water, right? In water, it can range from hours up to 10, 12 days,
Mm-hmm.
depending on the conditions. So again, we're talking about a really short time frame here.
Mm-hmm.
Glyphosate is not a persistent pesticide or persistent contaminant, like
Mm-hmm.
something that would have a half-life on the order of years. And like you said, if you keep applying it year after year, it's going to build up potentially in the soil and the water.
Okay.
That's not the case with glyphosate, and there's data to sort of support that and show that. Now, also, glyphosate does not bioaccumulate, which means it doesn't build up in the tissues of uh, organisms, fish, humans, moose, organisms that might be exposed. If we do consume it, we're able to metabolize it. And there's studies that have shown we will metabolize it, break it down, and excrete it. And so it won't build up in the tissues of organisms.
Gotcha. Okay. So talking about the half-life and the degradation of this chemical, I would imagine, for example, like 1 to 14 days for us or for plants isn't a lot, is a really short time period of time, but for like
Mm-hmm.
soil microbes and stuff like that are only alive for a small amount of time, that might be a very, very long time, right? So is there research
Mm-hmm.
being done on the actual microbes themselves and how that is being affected, if that's an
Yeah,
issue?
so people have done. I mean, the thing is, I mean, the major pathway of degradation. This is an interesting thing of glyphosate in, for example, soil,
Mm-hmm.
is microbial degradation, right?
Okay.
So the microbial community in the soil is actually using glyphosate as a source of carbon, right?
Ah.
So I mean, that's how a lot of organic contaminants break down in the environment. Is that microbial communities are very effective at using chemicals that are available in the soil as sources of carbon, right? Breaking them down. So um, there has been work done on looking at the microbia, like how the microbial community will break down, can break down glyphosate and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So um, so yeah, I mean, in terms of is glyphosate having a particular effect on a specific host of microbial organisms? I think there's maybe a few papers that have looked at potentially. There's some that are going to benefit more from the presence of glyphosate in the soil than others. But in general, there's really no evidence to show that glyphosate would have a long-term enduring adverse effect on the microbial community within the soil.
Really? This is, to be going into this, I don't know much about, the chemicals and herbicides and pesticides and stuff, but this is a better case scenario than I even imagined. I assumed that there would be some problematic stuff going on somewhere, right? Because every,
Mhm.
every action has an equal and
Yeah, I
opposite
mean,
reaction, right? So I
yeah.
assume there'd be
So
something. So,
yeah. So for example, like if you're a non-target plant,
mhm,
right, glyphosate is going to have an adverse effect on you, right?
of
So if
course, right.
if you're a broadleaf, well, not even it's effective against grasses as well. But if you're a non-target plant, no doubt that glyphosate is going to be highly toxic to you because that's what it's designed. That's what it does.
Right.
So we have to be careful about spray drift and how we use it, right? That's why there's best management practices in place.
Hmm.
We need to be sure that we use it in a way that it's going to be effective where we want it to be effective, and nowhere else. And the other thing is too is that within the use of herbicides in the forestry industry in Canada, there's a lot of BMPs um, in place to reduce potential exposure to things like lakes and rivers, right? There's mandatory setbacks. So, certain distances, 20, 10, 20 meters, that is a no spray area, right? You can't spray there because we want to avoid exposure to certain. So, I mean, there's the data showing that glyphosate really has low potential for non-target toxicity as long as you're not a plant, right?
Hmm.
But then there's also best management practices for the application of it to just avoid exposure to important ecosystems. Why expose when we can avoid it, right? Even
Right.
though it's relatively low risk to those organisms.
Right. So there's a lot of regulation when it comes. Even we're trying to hedge our bets and be like, hey, right now we know that this doesn't like, we know it's not having an impact on this stuff, but just to be safe, let's try to avoid it as much as possible. Anyways, that's yeah, no, that makes sense. That's smart to hedge
Yeah,
your bets that way.
it's a precautionary approach, and I mean because it's a blanket. Best management practices also apply to anything that's being sprayed, right? There needs to be a setback because we don't want it making its way, or we want to limit the amount that's going to the surface area. So yeah, I mean there's a lot of thought that's gone into not only what product to use, what pesticide to use, but then also how it's used, right?
Of
And
course.
how it can be used so it's effective, but then reduce exposure off site as much as possible.
Okay. So how much of a scientific debate is there around the use of like these pesticides, that not just glyphosate, but some of this stuff that is widely used and is highly researched? Is there like a, quote scientific consensus, or is there still a pretty vigorous debate going on in the community?
About glyphosate or
Well, sure. Let's stick with glyphosate, and
yeah,
then we can expand to other
because it's
stuff.
really you'd have to yeah, because I mean with glyphosate in general, what I would say is that there isn't there's pretty much consensus that it's relatively safe. So for example, um, you know all the different regulatory agencies in the different countries. So we have PMRA here in Canada, US EPA in the United States. We have EFSA, ECHA in Europe. So there's all these different regulatory agencies that are doing the same thing. They're all evaluating the data that exists and trying to determine whether there's an unacceptable risk to human health and the environment. And they are all coming to the same conclusion based on the data that's available, is that glyphosate doesn't pose, I mean, if used properly, right? Because there's a threshold for everything. Like we don't want to be drinking or have large amounts of glyphosate in our food. That wouldn't be a good idea. But
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Because I mean, like again, everything can be toxic, but if we're using it according to the best management practices, and based on the data that we have, the risk to human health and the environment is negligible.
Okay.
Um,
So what about like I've been reading a couple. I've been trying in research for this, talking to you. I was trying to find some naysayers, trying to find some
of
information to try and play devil's advocate a little bit. And
course,
so
yeah.
like the World Health Organization supposedly, and you tell me if this has been redacted or true or not. But what I found is that apparently they list glyphosate as quote probably carcinogenic in humans.
Yep.
So is that true? And what when we break that down, what does that mean? Because it sure sounds like they're just hedging their bets and they don't actually know.
Yeah, so this was a very contentious decision. So in 2015, an arm of the WHO is called the IARC, so the International Agency for Cancer Research or Research on Cancer. They came out with this decision, and they classify chemicals, as a carcinogen, probable, possible carcinogen. They have these different classifications. Anyway, they came out and said that glyphosate, I can't remember if it's possible or probable carcinogen.
I read probable.
Probable
Probably. Yeah.
carcinogen. Yeah. So the issue, so right away, the reaction to that was, because again, all these regulatory agencies in Europe, United States, Canada had all reviewed the data and come to a completely different conclusion, right? So 2015, this decision comes out, and all of those regulatory agencies, New Zealand, Australia, FAO, which is the agricultural arm of the UN, PMRA in Canada, US EPA in the United States, and the two organizations in Europe, EFSA and ECHA, all went back to review the data again to say, did we miss something? I mean, why have they come to this conclusion that we haven't? And they reviewed the data, and all of these documents are available to the public if you want to take a look at them. You really want to get into it. And they clearly lay out the data that they've used in coming up with a determination, but they all concluded that glyphosate is not a probable carcinogen. And so, which I get for the public, that creates a bit of a problem, right? You have an organization, a large organization saying it is, and then all these other regulatory agencies saying it's not. And I think the important thing to say is the big difference between IARC, the ones who decided it was carcinogenic, and the other regulatory agencies, the big difference is the data set that they looked at. So IARC looks at a very limited data set, and they very clearly lay out the data that they used in coming up with that determination, where the other regulatory agencies look at a much larger data set and are incorporating a much larger number of studies into their decision. And I think that's where we see the big difference is that if I don't want to use the cherry pick, but if you look at it, and because I don't think that IARC was meaning, like there was no, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. They weren't trying to come up with a designation of it's probable carcinogen. But when you only look at a subset of the actual data set, you can start to come to a different conclusion than if you looked at the whole data set. I mean, I think that's true for any issue, right? So for the public, I get that it creates a conflict, but it's important to remember that PMRA, US EPA, ECHA, EFSA, the organization in New Zealand and Australia, and the FAO, as an example, all have a lot of very knowledgeable people that are all going through this data independently and all coming to the same conclusion that glyphosate is not carcinogenic or not a probable carcinogen. And I mean, listen, if it was, if the data was pointing towards that, I would, because as an academic, you live and die by the data, right? Like that's what you use to sort of make conclusions. And so if the data was pointing in that way, I'm confident that Canada, the United States, Europe, other Western, other developed countries with a regulatory framework would have come to that same conclusion. If that makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense. I mean, a lot of people, they might look at a conversation like this one where we're kind of talking about the benefits and, the lack of concern regarding something like glyphosate, and they might go, "Oh, you're a corporate shill. You're not," you know what I mean? Yeah. You're not relevant. And it's easy to say that, but the reality is, like you said, you're an academic. Like you've got into this because you want to find the truth, not because you want to prove a thought that you had, right? The whole point is that science as a whole, the mechanism of science allows it to be speculated, or not speculated, but it allows it to be, what's the word? Proven time and time again in order for the scientific community to accept it. It's not like you're one person that's saying this. It's more or less a consensus, right? I mean, you could make the same argument with like climate change, right? Like 97% of climate scientists believe or say climate change is real, right? Yeah. And you're like, okay, so it is. And then, but some people will latch on to that 3% and go, see, there's people that say that it's not real and we shouldn't worry about it. And it's people like to latch on to those and kind of the echo chamber idea, right? They like to just latch on to those ideas that approve their thought of the world. So I think it's easy for people to look at this conversation and say that both you and I are full of shit and we're trying to, save our own skin and we're not being responsible. But the truth of the matter is this is science. Like people can look this up for themselves. It's kind of weird that
Well, and
we
that's
live in this situation.
and that's when I speak about these issues, like, for example, the Alberta Forestry Association. That's the thing I said. Like, listen, don't take my word for it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just outlining it, and I try to provide all the references and where I'm getting the information. And I say, go look for it. Don't go take a look for yourself. Don't, because I would agree. Don't just sort of trust be critical of the data that, or the concepts that are being presented to you, the ideas that are presented, no matter who they're coming from, right?
Yeah.
Look at what are they basing their decisions or their on, and yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, the data is critical, and it's important to look at the whole data set. I mean, we can't only look at portions of it, right? Because like you're saying, you can start to really sort of, support any conclusion if you start to look at pieces of it instead of the whole data, right? I mean, that's true for anything, glyphosate as well as any other scientific issue.
Oh man, like you look at something that's like been huge for a while, and it's the whole anti-vax movement, right? I'm like, there's literally no science to support that vaccines do any bad, but still,
Yeah,
plenty of people find a reason to not vaccinate their children or whatever, right?
yeah.
And look, and now we've got measles and polio as a thing again, thanks to
Well,
that.
and
So
exactly, that's a great
it's
example. I
yeah,
mean, there was a study that came out that said that there was a link between certain vaccinations and autism, right? And that was a single study. Since has been disproven and retracted, which means that the journal that it was published in just removed it because it was so poorly. You know, they just couldn't support what they were presenting anyway.
it
But
was
that one,
bullshit. It wasn't
yeah,
true.
yeah, that's true. I'm trying to be diplomatic, but yeah, but so that one study, is one out of, I would imagine, hundreds that have looked at the potential effects of particular vaccinations, right? But that one, people have put so much weight on, which again has been retracted, no longer, it's not even published in a scientific peer-reviewed journal, but its impact has been massive.
Yeah.
But we have, hundreds of other studies when these, vaccinations were being developed and clinical studies supporting that, there is a very, very low frequency of adverse effects, but in general, there's an overwhelmingly positive effect to preventing disease. But and then that's the thing. I mean, and that's, you got to look at the whole data set. You can't look at just a single study that either helps or that proves or disproves what you want to believe, right?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Um, like, how do you propose that we start to get this kind of good scientific information out there in a way that's not confusing? Like we were saying at the very beginning before we kind of started recording, getting this
Mm-hmm.
information out there so that people can digest it and understand it and realize the true nature of it, and it's not just a clickbaity,
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, I read this headline and that must be true, right? So
Yeah,
how do you think we can go about doing that?
that's a good question, and I think that, I mean, a lot of scientific societies and scientists are trying to are trying to find a good answer to that question. Is how can we more effectively communicate to the public the data that we're accumulating as part of our research and what that means for them and that kind of thing. And I think I don't have the exact answer for that. I mean, I think we got to take every opportunity we can to speak to organizations or public organizations or non-scientific meetings and that kind of thing to try to educate as many people outside of our own circles as we can. I think that's important. But as part of that, I think we need to to get some training and more effective communication to the public, right? Giving a scientific presentation is a lot different than giving a presentation to the public, and I think it's becoming more common that scientists are acknowledging that and making efforts to sort of more effectively communicate to a non-scientific audience. But more and more of that needs to happen. Now that said, I mean, if we look at the public, we have people that can sort of rationalize and logically look at an issue. You know what I mean? Like those people, that group you can sort of talk to and present the data and say, look into it for yourself, and they'll come up with their own conclusion, right, based on the data that's out there. They'll sort of take a logical approach to it. But there's always a small percentage of people that, unfortunately, it doesn't matter what data you present to them, they just will not move off their belief. And
Yeah.
and so you'll get scenarios where you're using conspiracy theories to sort of, you know what I mean, like to justify, explain your stance. So for example, they might say that, well, he's a professor, but he's an industry, like you said, shill, like he's, I don't know, influenced by industry, or industry is lobbying the government to, allow this product to be registered. And so, I mean, I don't know, when you're using conspiracy theories, something that's not, there's no data to back up to try to support, you got to start to wonder whether that's reality. Anyway, it can be very difficult.
You can convince yourself of anything, right? Like, you can convince yourself of anything if you're just sitting there with your buddy drinking a beer and thinking and passing the ball back and forth, trying to figure out what you think is going on, right? You convince yourself that the world is flat and that the world is controlled by time traveling, shape shifting lizard people that,
of course,
take the form of world leaders, right? Like, I mean, that's the road you're going down, right?
Are under the same issue, right? Is people think, oh, it's just big pharma wanting to make money on us, that we don't actually need them. These kind of things start to come out, but there's really no data to support that. I mean, but there's a whole bunch of data to show that, the measles, mumps, rubella prevents measles, mumps, and rubella. And so
weird, hey?
Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, listen, I'm sure there are nefarious things that go on in the world. I mean, we all, to believe that it doesn't would be naive, but really, I mean, we got to be able to sort of step back and think rationally about, and look at the data that we do have that's publicly available, that's peer reviewed, and make decisions based on that.
Yeah, trust the science. It's hard for people to, if you're not in that world, if you haven't gone to, post-secondary, it can be hard science can seem elitist or almost untrustworthy somehow. I don't know how that happens, but I hope that we can find our way towards a place where people can, trust scientists and stuff. But again, at the same time, even the people that seem to find those conspiracy theories, they will find those fringe scientists that support their claim, and then all of a sudden they're all about science for a half a second. But I don't know, it's part of human nature, I suppose. Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I forget, there was a philosopher, who talked about the affluence trap, when a society becomes more affluent. So, I mean, humans, our major concerns, right, are food, shelter, right? Those are our primary concerns. But you get into this trap when a society becomes affluent, where you're not really worried about food, you're not worried about shelter, like, that stuff's available. You start to worry about other things, right? You start to fixate on other small things that could potentially impact your safety or your comfort, right? Where before your focus was on, oh man, I gotta feed my family, or I gotta get some food or shelter, right? There's more immediate concerns. I'm not, so, and that's, I think, part of what happens is we start to fixate on these small things that are unseen, that we maybe don't fully have a great understanding of, and it can create outrage over something that is not really, it's a little bit unreasonable, but
for sure.
Yeah,
that makes sense. I mean, it's also, affluence is an interesting word as well, because although you're right, now we don't have to worry about feeding ourselves and clothing ourselves and that kind of stuff, because we're safe and we can go to the grocery store or whatever, and now we can focus on these smaller issues. Although a lot of times they get blown out of proportion, it's also what's brought us to the society we have today, right? Like this scientific community that can focus on, like, you could do an entire career on effects of pesticides on microbes, which most people would never think about in their entire life. So it's like, it's interesting though, the win-lose situation there, right? Yeah. I like not having to scrounge for food every day. It's pretty sweet.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing, is that if we get back to the pesticide issue, is that, of course, we need to regulate them like we're doing. We need to collect data before we start using them.
Are you clicking something?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. But we need to do that. But the other, we also need to look at the big picture, and we need to look at how they are. Pesticides do have an important role in modern agriculture, right? For us to be as productive as we possibly can per hectare of land, they play an important role. So if we can use them as safely as possible, I mean, because you can imagine as our population increases, there's a certain number of hectares on the globe that are set aside or currently being used for agriculture. But as our population grows, if we can't be as efficient or more efficient per hectare, then we're going to have to start to move into important natural areas and converting it to agriculture like we've done previously. Do you know what I mean? So,
Totally.
everything that we can do, including pest management, to be as efficient and on a hectare is important, and we can't just discount it because we think there might be an effect on environmental health or human health, right? I mean,
some unfounded concern.
Yeah, I mean the bigger concern for me, like if I'm because I love the natural environment. That's part of the reason why I got into what and I want to see it preserved. I mean, I don't want to see it degraded and that sort of thing. And when you look at the big picture, pesticides play a potential role in trying to prevent, I know it seems kind of counterintuitive, but if they can help us be more efficient per hectare, then it will reduce the likelihood of us having to sort of move into more, natural areas and degrade them because we need to produce food.
That's a good point, man. That's a real good point. I never really thought about it as actually assisting the environmental movement, right? As a lot of people see it as against the natural movement, when realistically like I would agree with that point, right? It's definitely pro. It's helping us be more sustainable in a weird way that's it's not a straight shot to that logic, right?
No, exactly. I mean, because in the reality is that there's a lot of data to show that if we don't manage pests, whether they're insects, plants, on agriculture, then there's large percentages of loss, right? And
yeah,
and that's a reality. There's tons of data, decades of data to show that the use of now, I'm not saying we need to rest on our laurels and say, if we find a particular pesticide that we think is having an unacceptable impact, we need to be okay with maybe not using that one or phasing out or restricting its use, for sure. I'm completely in support of that. And we need to continue to design better, more specific pesticides that are really specific to particular pests, but have very little non. We need to keep doing that. We need to get better at it. We also need to implement integrated pest management. I mean, I'm starting to talk more about agriculture, but instead of
that's okay.
But I mean, so I'm not opposed to us using less pesticides. If we can integrate, there's a number of practices we can use to sort of be more efficient per hectare of land. That's the best way to go. But I think that closed-minded, like, or we just need to ban everything. You're missing
simplistic.
the big picture.
Yeah.
And
it's kind of a childish view of the world. It's kind of just like, no, I say no, so no. And it's just not really considering that everything is gray. Everyone likes to look like, I find those people that are very on the fringe like that, they tend to see the world as black or white, and it's simple as that. And the reality is it's not, especially when it comes to science. We start to get down that rabbit hole of how everything is interacting, right?
Yeah, no, and exactly. I mean, it's a complex issue, and there's a lot of factors that need to be considered. And there's a lot of elements that it's easy to say, well, just ban it, that it'll solve all our problems.
Yeah.
But it creates other problems. So we need to be smarter about it. You know what I mean? We need to figure out ways that how we can continue to have tools in the pest management toolbox, but mitigate, right? Reduce the potential risk as much as possible. Banning is just easy, and from the perspective of decision making. But It's not like,
Well, and it probably would have so many detrimental effects that we can't even begin to
well, I
realize
mean, you
the
can
lack
ask,
of.
certain farmers, if they, who are responsible, they care about the environment. I mean, I work with a number of them here with some research projects like Guelph. They care about the environment. They don't want to think that their practice or their farming is having a detrimental effect on the environment, and affecting others' ability to enjoy the environment. Very forward-thinking people, um, and so anyway, they're following best management practices, doing everything possible to sort of mitigate the risk. But they could rely on a particular active ingredient, and if it was just to be banned, it would totally change their ability to do the type of agriculture that they do. And so one of the things you hear people throw around is like, well, just switch to a different crop. But that's easy to do in your back garden, right? I mean, if this year I want to do tomatoes, next year I want to do cucumbers, whatever. It's easy. But when someone has spent decades refining, the cultivation on hundreds of acres, it's not as simple as just switching to a different crop.
No, because the whole
So
world has demand for a certain amount of something, right? So if you can't just switch all of the corn crops over to
no,
whatever, I don't
yeah,
know, watermelons.
right, or something, or just go organic. That's another thing. It's like, well, just go organic. Well, that's easier said than done. And so, but anyway, these are all things that need to be considered. Now, not to say we need to sort of, degrade the environment because we need this particular type of crop. I mean, we may need to, but banning again doesn't solve the problem. It hurts certain types of agriculture. It hurts our efficiency, and and then we also we get into sometimes this vicious cycle of, we'll ban the stuff we know, new things will come on the market, and then we end up doing the same thing over again. And so
Mm-hmm.
we need to look at, like we've been talking about, all the data, and look at ways to sort of mitigate risk the best we can while still being able to manage, pest pressure.
Yep. Don't be afraid of technology, right? Like it's there to help. That's the whole
Yeah,
point.
no, exactly.
Yep. Awesome. So there's this TED talk that I came across, and it's from Tyrone Hayes, and he was talking about this research that he did regarding the use of atrazine, a commonly used herbicide in agricultural systems in the States and in Canada, and he had done a bunch of research around its effects on amphibians like frogs, and what is crazy things started happening. They said that these male frogs started developing uh, ovaries and producing eggs and actual like functional, female reproductive system, and genetically male frogs that had female reproductive systems. And this is not normal, and they would develop, several testes and several ovaries, and everything would be all screwed up. And they said this is because of atrazine. And I wanted to. This is a huge thing, and it's been up, it's been up in the media the last few years, and it obviously took off and went viral on the internet, and lots of people know about it. So I wanted to get you to address this atrazine thing and this study that Tyrone Hayes did, and just get your opinion on it, and if that's something we need to be worried about.
Yeah, so I mean, just to sort of talk about atrazine, and yeah, you're right. There was a lot of attention on feminization of male African clawed frogs. These type of frogs are often, like, they're not native to Canada, but
Right.
they're commonly used in research. Anyway, so there was a paper that came out in the Proceedings in the Natural Academy of Science, which is a very prominent high impact journal, from Tyrone Hayes and his research group. And what they were observing, and they report this in the paper, is that they were seeing feminization of these male frogs when they're exposed to atrazine at environmentally relevant concentrations, right? So concentrations that could be measured in the environment. So that was really sort of, it was sort of impactful. I mean, people paid attention to that. There was a lot of concern about, if it can do this to these frogs, this model organism, vertebrate, what is it doing to other vertebrates in the wild, and then potentially, what's the impact on human health? So, I mean, a lot of research followed that paper. I think it was I forget when it was, but there was a lot of research that came after that, to sort of delve deeper into this, feminization. Is atrazine acting like a estrogen? like feminizing male frog. So anyway, there was a lot of research, a bunch of research that went into looking into that. And the issue is that nobody could really repeat that work.
Oh, okay.
Do you know what I mean? So that's an important metric,
Oh, for
right? I
sure.
mean, in terms of the validity of research. And I mean, I'm not saying that Tyrone Hayes and his group, were, not upfront or honest about the work. Who's to know? But I mean, a number of people try to repeat that or look at it in other species and that sort of thing, or try to understand why that was happening in that species of frog. And first, the most important thing is nobody could really mimic that experiment. Like, the outcome was not repeated. So that called into question whether atrazine out in the wild would cause whether that was a real effect and whether it was something we need to be concerned about. And I think last year, or maybe 2016, 2017, there was a big review done on the effects of atrazine on fish and amphibians specifically. And so this was done by Glenn Vanderkraak and Keith Solomon and Mark Hansen, people prominent in the field of environmental toxicology. And they took every paper out there that looked at the effect of atrazine on fish or frogs. And they evaluated each of them according to criteria. They have, there's a number of ways you can evaluate studies,
Mm-hmm.
right? How do they report raw data? I mean, there's a lot of things that, would indicate this is a good study,
Of course,
right?
yeah.
It's a robust study.
Just because somebody did
so they
research
did that for
doesn't
all
mean that it's necessarily good research. It needs to be repeated.
Well, and just because it's published in a scientific journal or even peer-reviewed journal, I mean, it's not a perfect system, so you still have to read critically. And so what they did is they come up with a series of criteria, not unlike that have been used in human health, like in pharmaceutical or medical research to evaluate studies. And they each paper they went through and they evaluated it according to these criteria. And so what this is called is a weight of evidence. So basically all those papers would be considered evidence, for the potential effect of atrazine on fish and frogs, right? But some evidence is better than others, right? You weight some evidence more, heavily than others, right? Based on the quality of the evidence. So that's what they were able to do. And anyway, so I mean, their conclusion, and it's available, it's open source, so it's open to anybody. It's been peer reviewed. But their conclusion was that atrazine, at environmentally relevant concentrations does not represent a significant risk to fish and amphibians, and particularly the feminization or, the impact that it may have on that, an organism's endocrine system. The evidence just doesn't suggest that that's, a real thing or something that we need to be concerned about. Now, so say Tyrone's paper brought a lot of attention to it, and since then a lot of research has been done in evaluating whether that's a real thing, and sort of the conclusion would be is that it's not really something that we need to be concerned about.
Gotcha. It is weird because even
the repeat.
Go ahead.
So I was going to say the repeatability of a study is really critical. And often that doesn't get done. Nobody wants to provide funding to repeat studies. But when you have something that profound, really low, relatively low concentrations causing feminization in these frogs, people are going to go and look at that more closely. And when they did, it just couldn't repeat it, couldn't get the same results.
Yeah, well, that's a radical change. I mean, you imagine like there's pictures that he shows even in his TED talk of he's showing like the male testes and then showing ovaries and then another pair of testes and then ovaries all in the same frog, and you go, what the hell's going on? I don't know if that's normal in frogs or whatever, but yeah, it's very compelling, and I wonder, and like you said,
And that's the thing. No, it's not. Obviously, no, it's not normal. And clearly, those frogs that there's something going on, and something's been observed. And I mean, Dr. Hayes is a really a compelling. He's a really good speaker, and that sort of thing. But for me, the hurdle I can't get over is the repeatability.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like if others. repeat it or try it in a different species, or like, because people were trying that in native species, right? Because the African clawed frog is a great
Yeah.
model organism, but not in Canada, the U.S. So, and they just couldn't get the same result. So
What
that,
about his group? Has his group tried to do it again?
So that's the other thing too, is that there really hasn't been a lot of peer-reviewed literature out of his group since then, or shortly thereafter. I mean, if you take a look at just what if you go on Google Scholar, or you go and take a look at Web of Science, and you kind of look at what Dr. Hayes is, there really wasn't any follow-up to sort of,
that's kind of upsetting.
So that again makes you wonder. Yeah, because I mean, if you're, I don't know, like if I was secure in my result, and I was convinced, like, look, I did this, and this keeps, I repeated it, and it's happening again and again and again. You think you would put that data out there to refute people saying, well, I couldn't get the same result. And so anyway, I mean, that's difficult for the public to interpret, right? I mean, you sort of, you have scientists who do research, and then they're reporting conflicting results. Who do you believe?
Well, that's just it. Especially when it's
not they believe, but which results are correct,
Totally. Well, especially when it's on something as well respected as TED Talks, right? Because that kind of obsesses me quite a bit. Because I personally, like, I listen to a lot of those, and I tend to get a lot of like interesting ideas from that, and I find them intriguing. But to find out that they're promoting, this gentleman who I'm sure bears no ill will, but like that is not, it hasn't been backed up by the rest of the scientific community in any way, shape, or form. It's kind of frustrating for them to put it out there, because it's kind of like like clickbait more than it is scientific reality.
And I think that highlights. I mean, I think your highlight. You brought an important point to the forefront, is that just because someone, is giving a TED Talk, and this is a good example, right? I think the public think like, wow, this person gave a TED Talk. I mean, and especially if they're, a good speaker, and, it's easy to get wrapped up in that, but I think it's important to always check a number of sources.
Yeah.
Right. Sure. And sort of look at what if we're looking at various sources on this particular issue, what's coming back to us. I mean, that's the most important thing, or to delve deeper into it. Yeah. Right. But yeah, it is confusing for the public, right? You see a TED Talks, that's highlighting a particular issue, like this low amount of atrazine is feminizing frogs. Oh my God, what is it doing to us? Or what is it doing to, developing fetus, right? And which is definitely a valid concern, but the issue is you got to delve a little bit deeper into that research and see what others have done. I mean, there's a lot of research, and that's highlighted in this review that was done last year, the year before that. Like, I mean, there's a large number of papers that have looked at the potential effects of atrazine on fish and amphibians, and when you look at the totality of the research, and then you even evaluate each of those pieces of evidence, I think it provides a pretty clear picture that it's not something we need to worry about.
That's good to know. So that's not something that we're worried about in other chemicals like glyphosate or whatever. Then obviously it's not. We've never seen effects.
I mean, I don't off the top of my head, and I with glyphosate, and for example in Canada, the triclopyr, imazapyr, and glyphosate, that are the three herbicides that are used or reported to be used in forestry, glyphosate being the bulk of it, there hasn't been data to suggest that they would impact or affect our endocrine system, or cause feminization, so act like an estrogen or androgen, like male or female hormone. There isn't any data to suggest that.
Gotcha.
Right? So I don't think with those three, there really isn't any compelling evidence to suggest. The biggest, like we talked about previously, the biggest concern is with glyphosate and carcinogenicity. But that's another example, just like we're talking, that's another example of, you need to look at the totality of the research, and then, and I understand for the public, that's difficult to do.
Yeah.
Right. But there have been people that have, that's why we employ regulators that have the training to look at the totality of the research and come up with a decision. And that's why, when we see the decision coming from, EFSA and ECHA in Europe and PMRA here in Canada, then US EPA, and then New Zealand and Australia are all saying that glyphosate, when we look at the totality of the research, is not carcinogenic. You got to sort of weigh, okay, what's going on here?
No, for sure. That makes sense.
And so, and even so, another really kind of interesting example, which is, I think interesting for your audience, is that I don't know if I talked about previously about how they're using glyphosate to control coca in Colombia.
I don't think so, no.
So that's some research that like Keith and I have been working on. Is they use, because for example, coca in Colombia is usually grown obviously in isolated areas. Mm-hmm. So farmers will cut down sections of the jungle, burn it, and then grow coca. So you can't there's no access roads and that sort of thing. So a program that the Colombian government started was they were doing aerial spraying with glyphosate to control these sort of illegal plantations of coca. And so anyway, but the interesting thing is that when this IARC decision on the carcinogenicity of glyphosate came out, the health minister in Colombia immediately, wanted a halt to the program because they were using glyphosate. So the program stopped, and basically, there is no real other effective way to control the actual cultivation of coca, right? You can't send people there to mechanically remove it, or you know what I mean? So basically, production was just unfettered. Now, the government there has programs in place to try to incentivize farmers to move away from coca, but there's no, so there's the carrot option. But there's a lot of pressure on farmers, right? Whether it's actual, pressure from cartels or, the economic, the value of growing coca. But anyway, but there's no stick, right? There was, the spray program was gone. And so anyway, they saw production obviously go through the roof, right? Because there's no way of stopping it. Anyway, so recently with all these decisions from Europe, from Canada, from the United States, from other countries saying, reviewing the data on glyphosate and saying, no, it's safe for use. There's no, significant risk for carcinogenicity. Now the Colombian government is now looking at bringing the program back, right? Because it was an effective way to control coca. And so anyway, they're going through sort of these, there's some Supreme Court cases in Colombia that are ongoing because people are concerned about it starting up again.
Yeah, of course.
But the Colombian government, and particularly the federal police who are in charge of controlling, coca production, are sort of highlighting why it's really important. That it's an important tool.
Yeah.
You can't send troops out to all these remote areas. Plus, when you talk about risk to human health, right? I mean, having troops going out, cutting down coca represents a real risk to all those troops, like there's actually greater risk to human health from, speeding lead than, the use of glyphosate, to control it. So anyway, it's an interesting example.
Yeah. Oh no, for sure. It just seems like it's when you weigh in all the values and all of the things you have to think about, and we know that there's no real adverse effects, it just doesn't make sense that we can not use it just based off of some weird fear that it may do something that we haven't proven it to do something, you know what I mean? Like it's and
I mean, the thing is too, and the important thing is that it can, like the thing to recognize is that it can, if, in the spray program example, if you're not doing it properly, if you're not following sort of established best management practices, your application rate's way too high, you're overspraying sensitive aquatic systems. I mean, yeah, all these things can have detrimental effects on the environment, but a lot of work has gone into trying to develop best management practices so we can be as effective as possible at controlling the pests we want to control and limiting off-target movement or effects.
Right.
So, that's always the important thing to recognize. If we follow these established BMPs that are based on studies and data, then we can mitigate that risk to the aquatic and other terrestrial systems.
Yeah.
So
no, that makes sense.
But yeah, that so that's Yeah, and so it's interesting that now that they're looking at the totality of the data and the decisions that people have made, they're sort of reconsidering that sort of knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah, for sure. No, that totally makes sense. So just as a final kind of thing, I hear a lot of people talking about kind of in those naturalist movements, is a lot of them say that like they think we're going to move towards a more working with nature instead of against it. And I think we've kind of answered that question a little bit. I don't really think we are working against it, but I guess the argument around, monocrops and that kind of stuff, people seem to think that we might go more of a permaculture route in our society. I don't know. What would you say to something like that?
Yeah, I think I can't really speak to that level of integration, but I think one of the things in terms of like, how we're going to see, I would hope, and I think we're going to see agriculture adapt is more in terms of pest management, is the integrated pest management, which means, pesticides are just one tool, one potential option in your toolbox for
Yeah.
managing pests. We're starting to develop more biopesticides because as we get a better understanding of our pests, and their physiology and that, just how they operate. There are a number of biopesticides, so they're not, exactly a synthetic chemical, but they are pesticides that are sort of gleaned from nature, right? We've sort of using nature to help us manage. That's becoming more common. That said, there are still risks to those too, right? Just like I said, the dose makes the poison. Just because it's a biopesticide doesn't mean there's no risk and we can just go hog wild with it, right? Um,
Mm.
and then there are other, there's plant breeding, right? Plant genetics that, if we're looking from an ag perspective, that are helping us to manage pest pressure better in that way. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of science that's going into, being more efficient per hectare of land, and managing pests. And pesticides are just one tool in a large toolbox. And I think, and that's really, I think, the future of modern agriculture is only using it when it's necessary, right?
Right.
Not just a blanket prophylactic use of something. We have it there. We use it when the pest pressure dictates that it's needed, and therefore, yeah, we're sort of reducing the potential risk to the environment and human health, but still using our knowledge to sort of be as productive as possible.
Great. No, I think that's pretty digestible. I think it's hard to disagree with that. That makes
Mhm.
sense. Just be reasonable. Use the
Yeah,
science.
I mean,
Awesome, man.
that's what I
Well,
would
yeah,
say. Yeah, I mean, it sounds simple when you say it like that, but I don't know why sometimes, yeah, there's this distrust, but gotta get better at
it's there.
communicating.
It's
Yeah.
true. Yeah, that's inevitable. That's in every industry, every scientific research, right? All of it. It's always more communication. That always seems to be the problem. Teaching the
Yeah,
public.
yeah, totally.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, this is an awesome conversation. I think we covered the gamut of what I was hoping to get through. So I appreciate you taking the time to do
Sure.
this. This is awesome.
No, happy to do
Yeah.
it again. And this is like we talked about. It's important to get out there and to get out and tell the public that there's data that they can look into that help them clarify what's real and what's not real.
Yeah, exactly. Do your own research. Don't just trust
Yeah,
everybody blindly.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way to end it. Awesome.
Okay,
Awesome, man. This is great. I appreciate it. Thanks a
okay.
lot.
Have a good one, man.
Thanks a lot for listening, guys. I hope you guys liked that. I know I learned quite a bit, although I did some research into this beforehand. I learned quite a bit. It was awesome. Really, really good. Really makes me feel at ease when it comes to that kind of stuff on the on the landscape. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe. Listen to go back in the podcast archive. Listen to the last ones. There's going to be more coming in the future. I release them every 2 weeks. I hope you guys like them. If you have any questions, concerns, comment, rate my show, all that kind of stuff, you can you can email me at yourforestpodcast@gmail.com, and I get back to everybody. So until I get too big for my britches and I can't get back to everyone, which will be a long time from now, I will definitely get back to everyone. So thanks a lot, guys, and we've got some good ones coming for you in the future. So be sure to come back, check it out. All right, peace.